contemporary once said, "Beware the people who moralize about great issues. Moralizing is easier than facing hard facts," end quote. So as we're going to see today, as we analyze the question I've been given, a lot of times it may be hard to face the facts, but it is still quite necessary. So the question I am to answer today is this: can Australian Prime Minister Gillard win re-election? Due to the nature of the Australian political system and the state of its economy, we will see that Ms. Gillard has a very slim chance of re-election. So today, let's take a look at three main points as we consider this question. First, let's look at the nature of the Australian political system. Then, let's look at the state of the Australian economy. And then finally, let us consider the chances for success in the next election cycle. So first, let's begin by taking a brief look at the nature of the Australian political system. As an Economist Special Report on Australia reported on May 28th, the Australian political system has a 3-year parliamentary system, but really in actuality this provides for a 2.5-year electoral cycle. What ends up happening within this system is that campaigning never really stops, and the Australian representatives are never actually able to pass any serious reforms because they're constantly trying to campaign and run for re-election for the next electoral cycle. In fact, the focus is so much on the short term that these politicians are not able to fully explain their policies. Every time they answer questions, they always have it in the back of their mind that they're still running for re-election. So there really is no chance to pass true reforms due to the very nature of the Australian political system. So trying to get true reform passed is very difficult. But now let's move on and look at my second point, that of the state of the Australian economy. According to the New York Times, back in November, Australia raised interest rates for the entire country. Moreover, as Business Insider reported this past January, Australia had a record debt with rising interest rates, rising utility bills, and family finances were simply collapsing under the burden of the Australian debt. So the Australian economy is really in dire straits here. In fact, inflation has continued to increase, and this causes a serious problem for the Australian people as a whole. And it's something that the Australian politicians need to address, particularly the Prime Minister, if she wishes to win re-election again during the next election in 2013. However, as The Economist reported on March 31st, something that has harmed the Australian economy even more is that they have tightened the immigration policy. They're not allowing as many people to immigrate to Australia as they used to. So certain companies that have been doing very well have limited chances for success now. They're not going to do as well with this tightened immigration policy. As BBC reported on June 9th, moreover, Australia shed 22,000 full-time jobs this past May. This is the second consecutive month that Australia has seen a large decline in full-time employment. So we've seen, first of all, that the Australian political system is, in the first place, very hard to work with and to get true reform. But we've also seen that its economy is in a dire strait, and it must be reformed if the Prime Minister wishes to win re-election in 2013. So now let's look at my third and final point. Does Prime Minister Gillard really have a chance for success during the next election? Well, first let's look at some of the pledges that her party has made. Prime Minister Gillard belongs to the Labour Party of Australia, and they've made several pledges and promises to the Australian people that they need to accomplish if they wish to win re-election again during the next electoral cycle. According to The Economist, Ms. Gillard pledged before the last election cycle that there would be no carbon tax. However, now we see that she is advocating a mandatory carbon price in Australia. And in fact, 11% more of the Australian people are against this policy than are for it. So not only is she advocating something contrary to a pledge she made previously, she's advocating a policy that is contrary to the will of the Australian people. Moreover, her party has also promised to reform the budget to surplus by 2013, the next election. However, as the Sydney Morning Herald reported, the biggest challenge facing Australia right now is its global financial instability. So it seems almost impossible, due to the political system and the state of the economy, that Ms. Gillard's party will be able to accomplish true reform before the next electoral cycle. Also, Prime Minister's she seems to have a lack of a vision. She doesn't seem to know where she wants to go with Australia. As The Economist reported, Ms. Gillard once said that foreign policy is not my passion. For a prime minister, that is rather a startling statement, seeing as foreign policy is part of the job requirement. So if she really doesn't care about foreign policy, why is she even prime minister? In fact, that's the question that a lot of her opponents have been raising. Do we really want a prime minister who simply doesn't care about foreign policy and doesn't want to interact with other nations? Their answer is no. And so this also causes a serious problem for Ms. Gillard if she wants to win re-election in 2013. There are also several polls that have been conducted in Australia that show that her ratings have dropped quite severely. While she does have negotiation skills, even her opponents realize that she can negotiate very well. That may not be enough. In fact, the opposition party, the Green Party, appeals more to the younger, pragmatic voters. And this could also cause a severe problem for the Labour Party and for Prime Minister Gillard. ABC News also reported that the UN has currently been scrutinizing Australia for its human rights record. And so this also causes a black mark to appear on Prime Minister Gillard's record as the Australian people are trying to decide whether to vote for her again come 2013 or not. So in conclusion, we've seen that due to the nature of the Australian political system and due to the current state of its economy, Prime Minister Gillard really doesn't have much of a chance to be re-elected in 2013. I would like to close with this quote from former United States President John Adams, where he said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence.